Our next speaker is Professor Avram Shannon, another one of my star students. He has taught full-time in the Department of Ancient Scripture at BYU since 2017. He earned his bachelor's in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from Brigham Young University, a master's of Jewish Studies from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, with a graduate interdisciplinary specialization of religions of the ancient Mediterranean from The Ohio State University. And although I did my work at the University of Michigan,
we can still be friends, David.
I consider Avram my friend. I consider Avram having the perfect name for this conference. And he is a friend of God. His topic is that lineage, rival priesthood claims in the Book of Abraham.
Okay, I'm going to nuance that a little bit. The topic is actually on rival priesthood. We narrowed it down since my initial pitch to Abraham 1. So we're simply talking about Abraham 1 here. Now, the Book of Abraham is one of our books of scripture that is most concerned with notions and ideas of priesthood. So we have here, of course, in this, again, prologue part here, and finding there was greater happiness and peace and rest, all this thing. He's trying to find what's to be a greater thing. I became a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right according to the belonging to the fathers. And then in some ways, 1:4 really underscores this. I sought for mine appointment under the priesthood, according to the appointment of God under the fathers concerning the seed. In many ways, the doctrinal element that underscores and works its way through Abraham 1 is a question of priesthood, especially who was authorized to claim priesthood. Now, because of this, we'll only do a little bit with this here, but in many ways, this discourse of priesthood has occasionally been used, both within and without the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in a discussion of the priesthood and temple ban on people of African descent, which is part of the policy of the church before 1978. In this paper, I suggest, and will show, that the discussion on priesthood claims in the Book of Abraham makes the most sense in connection with an ancient discourse on rival priesthood claims, priesthood authority between Abraham and his family, and between forces in favor of Pharaoh and the Egyptianizing elements in his land and birthplace. What I suggest here is that we're going to extrapolate on what Stephen O. Smoot calls a ritualized struggle for cultic legitimacy. In this paper, I argue that the deployment of a hand tradition in the Book of Abraham does not reflect a native Egyptian ideology, as we do not find evidence for that tradition outside of Scripture. Instead, I suggest that this tradition originates in the traditions in Ur of the Chaldees, and that the Egyptianizing local elites are deploying this tradition on behalf of Pharaoh. Now, the Book of Abraham, as we've seen in some other discussions, is a complex work. Okay, according to the eternal chronology of the Book of the Hebrew Bible, the birth of Abraham dates to around 2000 BC. Okay, as far as the Bible is concerned, making this our earliest possible date for material in the Book of Abraham. Based on certain ancient parallels, some scholars, Jungi and others, have suggested the life of Abraham may be dated to the reign of Senusret III, around 1837 to 1819 BC. Okay. The various Josephine papyri, so the remaining fragments that we have, themselves date to between 150 BC and 8050, making this the last possible date for our material in the Book of Abraham. Okay, so these are the bounds for our discussion of Abraham. 2000 on the earliest, 8050 on the other end, because of the day of the papyri. Like David Calabro, I actually view the Book of Abraham as a redacted work, largely redacted in the Book of Abraham, in the Ptolemaic period, drawing a material from the Middle Bronze Age, but deployed by a later redactor in the Ptolemaic period. For the purposes of today's conference, I will be discussing the Middle Bronze Age notions of priesthood and how those show up in our Book of Abraham. A later paper, which is currently I'm currently working on, will show how those notions of priesthood are deployed by my putative redactor. Okay, this paper presumes that the arguments of Paul Hoskisson and others are to be maintained, and the Ur of Chaldees mentioned in Genesis 12 and Abraham 1 as Abraham's homeland and birthplace do not refer to the famous city of Mesopotamia, but rather to a place in the northern Levant. Finally, I think I have a map here actually. It's a rather crude map here, but so rather than over here, up here, up in the what I occasionally somewhat waggishly call the armpit of Turkey, right up there. Finally, this paper proceeds from the argument the Book of Abraham represents an authentic translation by the gift and power of God of material that Joseph Smith found on the papyri he purchased from Chandler. Now, there's a lot of discussion on this. The relationship between the papyri and our current Book of Abraham is a well-discussed issue in Book of Abraham studies right now. However, because our only remaining papyrus evidence dates to the Ptolemaic period, and because of other things David Caliber pointed out very nicely, especially connections to our Book of Genesis, this paper proceeds from the idea the translation is taken from a Ptolemaic document that has material that derives from earlier periods that have been worked by a redactor. Obviously, because we do not have access to our papyri, except for the fragments that are remaining, arguments about the translation must be on some level speculative. We just don't have enough data outside of what we have in our remaining papyri. Okay, with that note, and also with our map here, it should be stated at the outset, once again, as we think through what's going on here, our Book of Abraham is not set in Egypt and does not describe a primarily Egyptian milieu. According to Abraham 1:1, the story begins in the land of the Chaldeans at the residence of Abraham's father. In the Middle to Late Bronze Age, when scholars generally date Abraham and his descendants too, the narratives about them, the Chaldeans live in their original West Semitic homeland. I'm a little bit vague here with the archaeology because archaeology doesn't allow us to place it much more specifically than that. Okay, we don't have evidence for it. However, it's clear the narrative described in the first chapter of the Book of Abraham is therefore takes place in the Levant. The parallel between Genesis 12:10 through 13, and Abraham 2:21 and 25 suggests the narrative in our Book of Abraham appears set before the entry into Egypt. This is confirmed by Abraham 3:15, which the Lord tells Abraham that he reveals his cosmological material to Abraham before he goes into Egypt. Thus, no action in our Book of Abraham takes place in a purely Egyptian context, with the exception of Facsimile 3, which we've already talked about, is its own thing. Okay, so thinking then about this West Semitic context, besides Abraham, the primary cultic figure described in the Book of Abraham is the priest who attempts to sacrifice Abraham. He is described as both the priest of Elkanah and the priest of Pharaoh. That's in Abraham 1:7. Scholars of the Propagate Price have connected the Book of Abraham's Elkanah with an original Semitic Elkanah Koneh Haaretz, God creator or possessor of the land. Okay? However, this identification makes it clear that the primary deity being worshipped here is a West Semitic deity who was well attested in the northern Levant during the Middle Bronze Age. The fact that this priest of Elkanah is also the priest of Pharaoh indicates that this priest is part of an Egyptianizing party at Ur of the Chaldees. Smoot, Gee, Muleston, and Thompson, the very nice BYU studies piece they put together, the volume there, has suggested, quote, the worshippers at Potiphar's Hill, mentioned Abraham 1:10, were engaged in a form of Egyptian Canaanite syncretic religious practice. As we examine ritual practices described in our Book of Abraham, and we see what's happening in the northern Levant, we find the Book of Abraham accords well with what we find in the archaeological materials from this period, that this is primarily a West Semitic religious and ritual system that has some elements of Egyptianizing religion. Okay, archaeologists have found Egyptian stelae at various sites in the Levant. However, the earliest we find these is from the reign of Thutmose III, circa 1479. So a couple of centuries or more after we date Abraham II. We know from other sources that there's evidence of Egyptian cultural, including religious influence in Levant from earlier periods, and there's excellent work by Thompson, by Gee, by Smoot, by others working through this. However, what we find in northern contexts seems to point to the influence still being largely cultural, rather than directly political or military before the New Kingdom. Okay, there's some evidence there, but most of the evidence we find, almost all the evidence we find, points to it being a cultural influence. However, because of the close connection between ritual and cult on the one hand and political power on the other, it is not uncommon, we find this across the period anciently, to find Egyptianizing elements to use these kinds of claims and influence in support of Egyptian power and authority. This is what we find in our Book of Abraham, where the Egyptian claims to priesthood are being used to support Egyptian claims of hegemony. Okay, we're going to take a brief aside here. I don't remember where my slides were. It was a long time ago since you asked for them, so we'll see. Yeah, good. In the ancient Near East broadly, and in Egyptian specifically, kings were understood to be the premier servants of the gods, and therefore to be sacred and priestly individuals. Everywhere across the ancient Near East, kingship is said to be the specific and direct gift of divinity, and the holders of kingship are representatives of that gift. They also therefore serve as the chief religious and ritual officers of the gods on the earth. Egypt, of course, is no different from this, and one of the places in the Near East where it is most pronounced. A couple examples of this: the Egyptian king was the titular head of every ancient Egyptian temple and priesthood. The standard offering formula begins Hetep Dinah Sut, literally an offering given by the king. This means that ideologically, when others are giving offerings, they are performing a priestly function that had been delegated from an Egyptian king. Fundamentally, priesthood claims in antiquity are deeply embedded in a world of political and religious ideology. And this actually points out to one of the most intriguing absences in our Book of Abraham, the reference to a lack of a king over Ur of the Chaldees. When we're talking about priests in the ancient world, we should expect there to be a king who is, and in fact, we find it in the material from the sacrifice material. Nimrod is often the king that sacrifices Abraham. There is no specific king over Ur mentioned in our Book of Abraham. We'll talk through that in a second here. So, as Latter-day Saints, we are accustomed to a definition of priesthood that prioritizes divine authorization and organization, rather than an idea that has any kind of political implications. However, the Book of Abraham presents a very ancient notion in this notion of, we see the prologue to Abraham 1, I'll go back to it, you can see that real quick, where he sought for appointment under the priesthood, according to the appointment of God under the fathers concerning the seed. The reference here in this passage to fathers and seed are suggested that this priesthood is being understood here as generational and dynastic. Abraham expected some kind of priesthood, which antiquity would have sacrificial and cultic implications, that is right because of his descent and lineage. However, there is a barrier for Abraham that is preventing him from receiving this appointment, which is that his ancestors, meaning, and they have just talked about that at least his father, but probably his entire family for this, had turned from the righteousness unto the gods of the heathen. That's Abraham 1:5. Now, in particular, the narrative in Abraham 1 introduces an element of human sacrifice into the religious practices of this Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham 1:8 states, quote, I don't know if I have that quote or not. I don't. All right, we'll get there in a second. Now, at this time, it was the custom of the priests of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to offer upon the altar which is built in the land of Chaldee for the offering of these strange gods, men, women, and children. Now, it needs to be noted that human sacrifice is not the norm in any period in the ancient Mediterranean. We find places for it and whatever. Although verse 111 states the practice was done after the Egyptians, verse 110 seems to suggest something of a much more customary practice from the sphere of West Semitic religion practice. This verse says, even the thank offering of a child did the priest of Pharaoh offer on the altar which stood by the hill called Potiphar's Hill. The only kind of human sacrifice that had anything like regular usage in ancient Levantine contexts was child sacrifice. Although it was, again, it's still not common, and the meaning of many of these finds is hotly debated. Okay, this is a big deal in especially Phoenician studies and things like that. Now, in some places, and we find this throughout the Hebrew Bible, In some places, this meant primarily infant sacrifice, but there are actually contexts temporally and physically near where scholars place Book of Abraham's Ur of the Chaldees, where their sacrifice what would appear to be the sacrifice of adolescents. And of course, this has, as David Calabro pointed out very nicely to us previously, has strong resonances with God's command to sacrifice to Abraham, sacrifice Isaac, Genesis 22, and therefore has strong resonances with our Book of Abraham. Now, within our own Book of Abraham, there's a complex of reasons given. In verse 11, we refer to the death of 3 virgins at one time. The verse goes on to tell us these virgins were offered up because of their virtue. They would not bow down to the worship of gods of wood or of stone, therefore they're killed upon this altar. This verse then places the sacrifice, and therefore the attempted sacrifice of Abraham by his father, firmly in the realm of interreligious conflict. Now, the indication that these sacrifices are virgins is in continuity with this connection with verse 10, with the thank offering of a child. Again, placing this firmly in a West Semitic notion. However, there's one other fact about these individuals sacrificed to the priest of Elkanah that the Book of Abraham considers relevant. They are described as the daughters of Onita, one of the royal descent directly from the loins of Ham. According to our Book of Abraham, there is a tradition in Ur of the Chaldees that associated royalty with descent from Ham. Traditions of descent from Ham are otherwise only known from the biblical texts. And nowhere but our Book of Abraham do we find evidence for an association of descent from Ham with royalty. Now, as he does this sacrifice here, Abraham points out that he says, as they lift up their hands upon me, they might offer me up and take my life. Behold, I lifted up my voice unto the Lord my God. The Lord hearkened, and he filled me with the vision of the Almighty, and the angel of his presence stood by me and unloosed my bands. I do more of this in the written version of the paper, but the fact is you have then, in verse 16, and his voice was unto me saying, Abraham, Abraham, behold, my name is Jehovah. I have heard thee and come down to deliver thee, take away thee from thy father's house, etc. We have this notion, as it is framed in our Book of Abraham, Abraham 1:16 is Jehovah's initial revelation of his name to Abraham. And we may want to make connections with Exodus 6 and this notion that before the revelation, again, there's some temporal issues with this, but there is a sense in Abraham 6 that God is known previously by the name of Shaddai, which is translated into KJV as Almighty, and now he's known as Jehovah. And so you get a similar thing to that temporal scheme in Exodus 6 present here in Abraham 1. However, this suggests that in the rich religious practices that come down to Abraham from his ancestors, that God was not known primarily by the divine name Jehovah, as Jehovah reveals it to Abraham when he rescues him. Jehovah then connects this to this notion of priesthood and says, having revealed the name, he says he's going to rescue him from the land and destroy the forces that are going to kill him. He then promises, behold, I will lead thee by my hand, and I will take thee and put upon thee my name, even the priest of thy father, and my power shall be over thee. Thus, in the Book of Abraham, the revelation of the name of Jehovah is connected with the priesthood of Abraham's father. All right. Abraham 1 makes it clear that for the Book of Abraham, priesthood is understood as a family affair. It is the right belonging to the fathers. It is given according to the appointment of God under the fathers, concerning the seed. It is the priesthood of Abraham's father. These are all evident examples from our Abraham 1. The idea of priesthood in Abraham's original environment does not appear to be understood in anything like hierarchical or ecclesiastical terms, in part because there is no church for it to be associated with. Okay? Abraham, and this relates in some ways to David's previous point about the push of the Book of Abraham narratively towards a personal approach rather than even a national one. Abraham is apparently trying to restore privileges that were once the right of his family. Now, family and lineal association with priesthood will attest in the ancient world. In every stage of the ancient Mediterranean religion we have access to, we find reference to priesthood and cultural responsibilities built in families and descent groups. However, and as we return to the rivalry part, One of the drivers by the narrative in Abraham 1 is a rivalry between Abraham's priesthood claims and those claims being made on the behalf of Pharaoh by Egyptianizing elements in Ur of the Chaldees. It is those claims we turn next in our discussion. As we have seen, in Abraham 1:18, God promised Abraham he'd put his name on him, which in the text is associated with giving Abraham the priesthood of his father. This is followed in the text by the destruction of the priest who was attempting to sacrifice Abraham, who was both the priest of the native Elkanah and the priest of the imported Pharaoh. The fact that he's a priest of both then suggests that he is one of the native West Semitic elites who is part of the Egyptianizing party in Abraham's city and homeland. Abraham 1:20 tells us that this priest's death was mourned in the court of Pharaoh himself, presumably after the many months it would have taken for that news to travel to Egypt. Okay, we're looking at about 800 miles here, roughly, between, again, wherever in the Delta, wherever in Egypt you want to put it, and between wherever in the west, northern Levant you want to put it. The book of Abraham then signifies that Pharaoh, states that Pharaoh signifies king by royal blood. And this then signals a lengthy aside in our book of Abraham on the lineage of Pharaoh and why Pharaoh was disqualified from priesthood claims. The importance of this aside is indicated by the comment in Abraham 1:27 that in many ways speaks to the theme of this entire section. Do I have it here? I don't. Okay. I have to read it. Trust me on this one. Now, Pharaoh, being of that lineage by which he would not have the right of priesthood, notwithstanding the Pharaohs would claim it from Noah through Ham, therefore my father was led away into their idolatry. The phrase, my father was led away by their idolatry, indicates that Terach, now the name of Abraham's father is not mentioned in our book of Abraham, but we know from the biblical texts, had apparently been persuaded to give up his own priesthood claims in favor of those of the kings of Egypt. Now, what is intriguing for us as we think through this is the way it frames Pharaoh's claims to priesthood by reference to a specific claim to genealogical or lineal descent. Although Pharaoh is of that lineage who could not claim the right to priesthood, he's actually claiming a right to priesthood through Noah and Ham. Now, it is useful to compare Abraham 1 with another place where we find discussion of the Hamitic descents of Noah, the so-called Table of Nations in Genesis 10. As we compare these two passages, it is important for us to maintain a nuanced view. On the one hand, as Latter-day Saints, we affirm the essential historicity of the biblical record, including Genesis and Abraham. On the other hand, there are numerous places in the Table of Nations, Genesis 10, that do not accord with modern anthropological or archaeological evidences, and even places where Abraham and Genesis seem to disagree with one another. The 2022 Come Follow Me manual is useful for us to think with on this point. Quote, here's something to continue to think about as you begin reading the law or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. These books, which are attributed to Moses, probably passed through the hands of numerous scribes and compilers over time. Still, the books of Moses are the inspired word of God, even though they are, like any work of God transmitted through mortals, subject to human imperfections. Close quotes. Our Table of Nations in Genesis 10 seems to reflect the understanding of an ancient Israelite author living in the ancient Mediterranean, as almost all the identifiable nations in the table are people, nations, or ethnicities from in and around the ancient Mediterranean at a very specific time period in Israelite history. Okay, and there's scholarship on this. If you're interested, I can point you in that direction. It's my footnotes in the published version. A similar statement can be made about the ethnic or lineal claims in the book of Abraham, including Hamitic descent for the Pharaoh and the Egyptians. The statements that in the book of Abraham should be read to represent the work of inspired authors and editors reflecting their ancient understandings, rather than reflecting modern anthropological notions. And a great place to highlight this is this notion of the book of Abraham on the blood of the Canaanites. Okay, you remember our book of Abraham. We have it here. Now, this king of Egypt was a descendant from the loins of Ham and was a partaker of the blood of the Canaanites by birth. From this descent sprang all the Egyptians, and thus the blood of the Canaanites was preserved in the land. The difficulty that we face as modern readers of this text in connecting the blood of the Canaanites with in our Book of Abraham with historical Canaanites is that the phrase Canaanite does not refer to a single people or nation in antiquity. George A. Pierce has observed, quote, Canaanite as a collective term for the Semitic-speaking people living in the Levant seems to be applied to those people by other non-indigenous groups, such as the Egyptians, or those who can distinguish themselves from that group, like the Israelites, effectively emphasizing the us versus them aspect of the narratives focused on the conquest and the settlement of the promised land, close quote. Thus, the people described in antiquity as the Canaanites, especially in our biblical text, are not a single people with a single origin. Neither in antiquity is Canaanite ever used as an in-group name. It is only used by outsiders to describe other groups. All of this makes identifying the valence of blood of the Canaanites in our Book of Abraham very, very difficult. Okay? To the point where I'm not actually going to try, other than to say it's tough, and we can work through that here and thinking through it. On top of this, the present author, I, am unaware of any native Egyptian text that claims Semitic descent for the Egyptians or for the Egyptian king. Narratives about Ham or Shem or Noah only appear in the Hebrew Bible, suggesting, as David previously suggested for us here, that the primary point of conversation for the Book of Abraham traditions is in conversation with the Bible primarily. This is, again, part of the evidence for redaction here. Thus, with that notion, if we were to construct a plausible context for these claims in a Middle Bronze Age environment, so before the compilation of our present Bible, any claims about lineage seem to have been made by locals on behalf of the Egyptian pharaoh, i.e., the only evidence we have for these kinds of claims comes from Semitic texts. Therefore, for my suggestion, the best way to suggest that is that these claims are also deriving from a Semitic environment. Based on our available Egyptian evidence, the Egyptians used different arguments and different narratives to make their claims for priesthood in their own environments, for their own internal claims. A claim to Noahide, or Hamitic, or Semitic for that matter, is only meaningful in a context that has traditions about Noah. Therefore, it seems likely that these claims in the Middle Bronze Age environment are being made on Pharaoh's behalf by those and to those whom the arguments would be persuasive. This then can help bring to the forefront the idea that the function of the discourse in Abraham 1 is to explain Abraham's claim to rights to his fathers, which is specified in Abraham's priesthood. Those who are exerting hegemony over her, the Chaldees, are claiming Noahide descent through Noah and are using that claim to claim cultic authority in the region. This runs directly counter the claims of Abraham, and at least theoretically of his ancestral clan. These claims are being made on behalf of pharaohs who were controlled during Abraham's time in Ur of the Chaldees. To the present author, this seems primarily to reflect an ideological claim on the part of Egypt's representatives in Ur in order to shore up power in the region, deploying a putative native tradition. As we look at the Middle Bronze Age religious and ritual environment described in Abraham, there is one point that comes into sharp focus. We have noted previously, throughout the ancient Mediterranean, cultic and priestly matters are the purview of kings, who delegate those responsibilities to others. As we look to priests and priestly claims in Abraham, there is no king present except for Pharaoh, whom the book claims descends from Ham. There are, however, the daughters of Oneida, quote, one of the royal descent direct from the loins of Ham. As noted, the stated reason for the sacrifice of these young virgins is because they would not worship in the way prescribed the priest of Elkanah, who was the priest of Pharaoh. I suggest these individuals are part of the local royal family in the city of Ur of the Chaldees, who were killed in part because of their royal connections. It is not clear the connection between this Oneida and a putative king of Ur, but it is clear the Book of Abraham presents a connection between royalty and descent from Ham. Because there are no extant Egyptian texts making this connection, but we do find traditions about Ham in texts of Semitic origin, meaning again the Bible, I argue the tradition that Abraham is working against originates with the royal family or the Chaldees rather than in an Egyptian context. The tradition is then co-opted by an Egyptianizing party represented by the priests of Elkanah and some members of Abraham's family. The Egyptianizing representatives of Pharaoh are claiming priesthood and therefore cultic authority for king of Egypt through traditions suggesting a putative descent from Ham. These daughters of Oneida are presented as being also royal descent through Ham. In this scenario, their authentic claim to Hamitic descent could be a threat to the claims of the Pharaoh being made on his behalf by these Egyptian elements. There is therefore an element of political control here, not simply ideological disagreement. This claim is persuasive to Egyptian Semites living in Levant at the time, including Abraham's own family. Our Book of Abraham describes it as idolatry. My argument for later on is that's actually probably reflects our redactor because the nations of idolatry develops in ancient Israelite and Jewish thoughts. Okay? Thus, in our Book of Abraham, we have an example of local West Semites supporting the claims of the Egyptian monarchy using a local tradition that they are descended from Ham to bolster their claims to divinity and divine kingship among non-Egyptian populations, such as those inhabiting Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham comes from another local lineage who also claims priestly and cultic authority through his family line back to Noah. This is the rights of the fathers that he's looking for in the beginning of Abraham 1, and that God promises him when he is saved from the priest of Elkanah, who is also priest of Pharaoh. The entire narrative about Pharaoh's lineage and cursing will explain why Abraham's family are giving up their rights and why those rights revert back to Abraham. We learn later in chapter 1, he's going to tell us why that is. As David reminds us, our Book of Abraham does not appear to be complete. We never actually get the finishing of Abraham's argument. But what's intriguing about this, especially in terms of some 19th century discourse on Book of Abraham priesthood, is the way it flips the script on claims the Book of Abraham as evidence for Latter-day Saint priesthood ban. The only explicit tradition about Ham and priesthood in the Book of Abraham states that Pharaoh claimed priesthood because it's descent from Ham, rather than being denied it. There is no statement in our Book of Abraham that Ham was cursed, only Pharaoh. There is a statement that from Ham sprang that race served the curse in the land, but unless the Pharaoh in 126 understood to be Ham, which is, I guess, a possible reading of the text, the connection between the curse and this curse and the curse on Pharaoh is not clear to the present author. However, what is clear from the text is that we have two competing traditions which specify a specific, likely Hamitic tradition being cursed right of priesthood, and wants to use that same lineage as a place to claim priesthood. These claims are being played out in the local religious and political landscape in Ur of the Chaldees. In conclusion, as we think through this, one is to recognize the fact that there is there's more going on here in terms of what's happening in antiquity, but specifically this is part of the purpose narratively of our portion of the Book of Abraham is to provide us with explanation and background for our book of Genesis, to remind us that Abraham had a reason to go to another place, to find a covenant, to get the priesthood of his fathers that was promised him by Abraham. Thank you very much.
So in connection with priesthood in the Middle Bronze period, could you just briefly discuss the form and function of covenant in the Book of Abraham in terms of that same ancient context?
Sure. So one of the key things about, again, fundamentally when we talk about priesthood, and even with covenant, right? Covenants are fundamentally relational. And the priest's job in the Middle Bronze Age, and actually I'd argue throughout, is to serve as the representative of the deity in sacrificial context, in ritual context, and in these various contexts. And so this idea of covenant creating a relationship, and of course, again, the Book of Abraham hits this really hard, this idea of the relational nature of it and things like that. This idea, even in a Middle Bronze environment, it's the proper relationship that is being modeled by the priestly officer.
Okay. Have you considered a matriarchal leadership in Abraham's time? It seems this is less clear as opposed to after Sinai. It was pure male leadership.
So the trouble is the nature of our sources, which are largely written by men for male audiences. Okay, this is just the nature of, an unfortunate nature, by the way, of antique discourse. And so we have evidence in various Middle Bronze Age environments of cultic material being played out by female ritual officers. It's about as vague as we can get it, but saying there are examples of what we would call priestesses in a Middle Bronze Age environment. Yes. Even in Levant. Yes. However, we need to be, and this is part of a little nuance that I show about even stronger there. We need to be careful associating priestly roles too much with what we would consider notions of leadership. Because again, the cultic head and the leader is going to be the king, and priests work and operate in that environment. And so although we definitely find female cultic officers and officiants in terms of what we'd call leadership, not really, but again, that may simply be a result of the biases in our sources rather than a reflection of what we're finding necessarily, because we just don't have comparative sources from the female priestly officers.
Great, thank you so much, Avram.